Something felt deeply wrong on the tarmac of a quiet airfield near El Paso, Texas, on the afternoon of July 25, 2024. A twin-engine turboprop touched down without prior warning, its engines whining to a halt. Two figures emerged from the cabin into the stifling heat. One of those travelers carried 76 years of weight, and for half a century, no steel bars had ever enclosed him. Federal agents and Homeland Security personnel stood waiting, their hands near their holsters. Within minutes, Ismael Zambada Garcia, the notorious figure known across the globe as El Mayo, found himself bound in foreign steel on American soil. This mastermind co-founded the Sinaloa Syndicate, outlasting partners, rivals, and successive presidents alike. Though the United States State Department once posted a $15 million bounty on his head, the reward sat unclaimed for decades. Suddenly, a lone flight crossed the international boundary, dissolving a 50-year empire in a matter of hours. Yet no voluntary surrender or backroom deal guided his steps onto that flight. A trap had closed around him. This betrayal would ultimately spark a fierce diplomatic dispute between two sovereign powers, centering on a single unresolved mystery. Who actually engineered his arrival on that tarmac? To understand how we reached this tarmac, we must first examine the deep fractures that had been spreading through the security apparatuses of both nations for years. The narrative of this surrender does not begin in 2024. It begins decades earlier, in the shadows of institutional corruption that made cooperative international policing nearly impossible. His name was Genaro Garcia Luna, and on paper his authority over Mexican law enforcement was absolute. Under his command was the Federal Investigative Agency, before he assumed the role of Secretary of Public Security, the precise office tasked with leading the nation's struggle against illicit narcotics. Working hand in hand with American agencies, this security chief sat across from United States officials as a deeply trusted partner. Yet back in 2006, inside a private room at a restaurant in Mexico City, a syndicate lieutenant named Jesus Zambada hand-delivered duffel bags containing $3 million in cash. The very official directing the war against the syndicate drew a large salary from the syndicate itself. This double life continued for years, poisoning the trust between the neighboring countries. On October 16, 2024, an American federal tribunal sentenced Garcia Luna to over 38 years behind bars for pocketing those illicit payouts. The country's premier law officer had been purchased. Recognizing that betrayal, the subsequent clandestine American operations no longer resemble mere diplomatic overreach. They present themselves as the only viable path forward for a frustrated superpower. The lack of trust only deepened as the syndicate demonstrated its absolute dominance over local security forces. To comprehend the leverage these organizations held, one must examine the events of October 17, 2019. On that afternoon, Mexican federal security forces moved on a luxury residence in Culiacán, the capital of Sinaloa. Their objective was to detain a 29-year-old named Ovidio Guzman Lopez, one of the influential sons of the imprisoned drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The operation was technically successful, but the victory lasted only minutes. As soon as the handcuffs clicked, the entire city erupted into an organized war zone. Hundreds of heavily armed syndicate gunmen flooded the streets, establishing roadblocks with burning vehicles, and attacking military housing complexes where the families of soldiers lived. Inside the surrounded house, Ovidio Guzman Lopez surrendered with his hands empty and raised, and was soon after handed a mobile phone. In a desperate voice recorded by military cameras, he pleaded with his brother to halt the onslaught, shouting that he had already surrendered and begging for a ceasefire. But the syndicate's army had no intention of backing down, faced with the immediate threat of a civilian slaughter and the annihilation of his troops. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador made a decision that shocked international observers. He ordered the immediate release of the captive. The government had captured one of the most wanted figures on the continent, only to let him walk out the front door to prevent further bloodshed. The syndicate had successfully held an entire, modern city hostage, proving that its physical power could rival, and sometimes exceed, the sovereignty of the state. The state, however, did not forget the humiliation of that capitulation. On January 5, 2023, before the first light of dawn broke, over the mountains, specialized Mexican troops returned to Culiacán for Ovidio a second time. It was a full-scale military campaign, not a standard police raid. High overhead, heavily armed helicopters circled, providing close air support, as elite ground units moved in. This time, there would be no negotiation, and there would be no release. The syndicate fought back with desperate ferocity, but the military held its ground. By the time the smoke cleared and the gunfire finally ceased, 29 people lay dead. 10 of those casualties were military personnel who lost their lives in the line of duty. 19 were syndicate combatants. While the city braced for another wave of chaos, the arrest held firm. Ovidio stayed in custody, and this time the government in Mexico City was determined to keep him behind bars. Yet capturing a high-profile prisoner solved only half the problem. The more complex challenge was preventing another violent jailbreak or uprising. While Mexico could hold him temporarily, keeping him within national borders presented an ongoing threat to domestic stability. The definitive resolution to this dilemma came not from within Mexico, but from a federal justice hall located 2,000 miles to the north. Before Ovidio's definitive destination was decided, American federal prosecutors made a public disclosure that strained diplomatic relations to their breaking point. On April 14, 2023, the United States Department of Justice unsealed detailed indictments against 28 prominent members of the Sinaloa Syndicate. Deep within the legal paperwork lay a revelation that caught the Mexican government completely off guard. To build this large-scale conspiracy case, undercover agents and informants from the Drug Enforcement Administration had spent 18 months operating to infiltrate the cartel's networks. They had infiltrated local manufacturing networks and shipping routes, gathering intelligence on fentanyl distribution. More importantly, they had done so without the knowledge or authorization of the Mexican presidency. Foreign operatives had worked in absolute secrecy, on sovereign Mexican soil, for a year and a half. While the indictments represented a major triumph for American federal prosecutors, they also served as a quiet, public admission. Washington no longer trusted its southern neighbor to combat the syndicates internally. This deep-seated mistrust paved the way for more aggressive legal actions. On September 15, 2023, after months of legal maneuvering, Mexican authorities formally extradited Ovidio Guzman Lopez to Chicago to stand trial on charges of narcotics trafficking and financial crimes. This transfer followed the strict, established protocols of international law. Both governments signed the necessary treaties, and the transfer took place through official, public channels. It stood in stark contrast to the irregular events that would unfold 10 months later, when an elder statesman of the underworld would be delivered to the United States without a single legal document or official signature. The formal path of extradition had been set, but the informal path was about to rewrite the history of international law enforcement. To understand the betrayal that occurred on July 25, 2024, one must look at the internal fractures dividing the syndicate itself. Joaquin Guzman Lopez, another son of El Chapo, had been engaged in quiet, unilateral negotiations with American authorities for months, seeking a way to secure leniency for himself and his brother. The primary currency he offered was the one man who had remained untouchable for 50 years, Ismael El Mayo Zambada. In the days leading up to July 25th, El Mayo had left his secure mountain refuge to seek medical treatment in Culiacán, believing he would also attend a political mediation. He had been told that a prominent local politician and a university official were locked in a dispute, and they required his undisputed authority to settle the matter. He arrived at a ranch outside Culiacán expecting a diplomatic meeting. Instead, he walked into an ambush organized by his own partner's son. They bound his wrists, placed a physical restraint over his head, and forced him into the back of a pickup truck. From there, he was driven to a private runway nearby. Joaquin Guzman Lopez forced the aging leader onto a Beechcraft King Air, and the twin-engine turboprop took off, climbing into the sky and heading directly north toward the United States border. El Mayo had not agreed to surrender. He had been abducted by the son of his lifelong associate and delivered directly into the hands of waiting American agents in Santa Teresa, New Mexico. The capture of El Mayo was the crown jewel in a global offensive against the organization's infrastructure, not an isolated event. American law enforcement agencies simultaneously targeted the financial networks and low-level operatives that kept the syndicate functional. In Southern California, a coordinated FBI operation successfully dismantled a sophisticated money laundering web that had laundered over $50 million, seizing approximately $5 million in illicit cash. Following this financial blow, during a 5-day window in late August of 2025, the Drug Enforcement Administration executed a coordinated sweep across the globe. This operation resulted in the arrest of 617 syndicate operatives across 23 distinct regions of the United States and 7 international locations. The pressure was relentless, targeting every level of the organization. Yet despite these sweeping structural blows, the primary focus remained on the aging leader sitting in a federal detention center. On August 25, 2025, in a heavily secured federal tribunal in Brooklyn, Ismael El Mayo Zambada entered a guilty plea to charges of racketeering conspiracy and being a principal leader of a continuing criminal enterprise. To secure this plea, American prosecutors removed the possibility of the death penalty from the table. For a man who had spent half a century outwitting the global law enforcement apparatus, this formal admission of guilt in an American tribunal marked the definitive end of an era. The fallout over the capture did not quiet the international storm. Instead, it intensified the diplomatic friction between Washington and Mexico City. Between July 7th and July 9th, 2026, the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, announced a formal state investigation into the incident. Her administration demanded detailed answers regarding whether federal agents from the United States had violated Mexican sovereignty, and specifically whether American officials had misrepresented their involvement in the abduction of a Mexican citizen from sovereign territory. The fundamental argument presented by Mexico remained clear, no matter how high-profile the target. A unilateral abduction executed on foreign soil without local consent constitutes a direct violation of international law. Relations deteriorated further later that month when the private turboprop used to transport El Mayo was placed on public exhibition at an aviation museum in New Mexico. Mexican political leaders reacted with public outrage, viewing the unauthorized flight and abduction itself as a severe, direct breach of their national sovereignty. The judicial proceedings reached their final chapter on July 20th, 2026, in that same Brooklyn chamber. United States federal judge Brian Cogan handed down the definitive sentence. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, now 76 years old, was ordered to spend the remainder of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. A lifetime behind concrete walls without the prospect of ever breathing free air again. Yet the syndicate he left behind did not dissolve with his incarceration. Instead, the sudden vacuum of power at the top tore the organization apart. The capture of El Mayo, combined with the earlier arrest of El Chapo's son Ovidio, fractured the enterprise into two warring factions. One side remained fiercely loyal to the remaining sons of El Chapo, a faction known as Los Chapitos. The opposing side rallied behind the loyalists of El Mayo, calling themselves La Maiza. Rather than dismantling the trade, the removal of the senior leadership merely removed the traditional mechanisms of mediation, triggering a brutal turf war that immediately consumed the streets of Sinaloa. The central mystery of that July afternoon remains a point of friction between two neighboring nations. While Joaquin Guzman Lopez physically delivered the aging syndicate boss to El Paso, the exact degree of American foreknowledge remains a closely guarded secret. The transaction bypassed formal extradition treaties, leaving Mexican authorities to parse the legal aftermath of a unilateral capture on their soil. A lifetime of evading military operations, intelligence networks, and international bounties ended not with a large-scale raid, but with a quiet betrayal by the son of his former partner. The files on this capture continue to slowly surface, revealing a complex web of backroom negotiations and geopolitical maneuvers that went far deeper than a simple arrest. For the streets of Sinaloa, the consequences of that flight continue to play out in real time, proving that while individual leaders can be removed, the deep-seated structures they built remain difficult to dismantle.